In a blown-out hospital in Beirut, Lebanon, a group of young children were huddled together on the floor. They were all alone. Some of them were very sick, and all of them were afraid. They were caught in the middle of a terrible war with nowhere to go. But for the first time in many days, a new sound had replaced the sound of guns outside the building. 4 trucks with bright red crosses on them had pulled up to the hospital. Soon there was a friendly face smiling down on them. Loving hands were picking them up and hugging them. There was a small woman in white robes carrying them and leading them to the safety of the trucks. Minutes later, they were safe and headed for East Beirut, far from the ruined hospital, farther still from the guns and war. Who was this loving nun who brought laughter and hugs and safety to those frightened children and children like them all over the world? Her name was Mother Teresa. 40 years earlier, she had carried a dying woman off the streets of Calcutta. Some people thought she was foolish, but she continued to see the face of Jesus in the face of each person she helped, and in time, her love and kindness spread all over the world. Mother Teresa was born on August 26, 1910, in the city of Skopje, the capital of Macedonia. It was a city filled with people of many different religions and many different backgrounds. Each group hoped to have their own country, with their own freedoms. Nicola Boyajiu was one of these men. He loved the city of Skopje. He had helped to construct many of the buildings in town. He also hoped for independence for his Albanian people. But today those thoughts were far from Nicola's mind, for Nicola's wife, Drana, had just given birth to their 3rd child. Drana gave her baby girl 2 names, Ganja, which means flower bud in Albanian, and Agnes, which means lamb. The next day, Aji and Lazar, the new baby's sister and brother, watched closely as an Albanian priest poured water over Agnes's head and placed a grain of salt in her mouth. Ganja Agnes Boyajiu, he said, I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Agnes was made a child of God that day. As Agnes grew, she spent her days playing with friends in school and joining her family at church. Starting at a very young age, Agnes went along with her mother as she visited and cared for the poor people living in Skopje. It was a happy childhood spent in a house filled with laughter. But one night, when Agnes was 9, all of that changed. Nicola had been away at a political meeting. He and his friends were discussing freedom for the Albanian people. On his way home from the meeting, Nicola suddenly became very sick. His family quickly took him to the hospital, but it was too late. How could this have happened? Drana asked. Was it because of the meeting? Was he poisoned? The family never learned the answer. What would Drana and the children do without Nicola? Drana knew. She opened a small embroidery business in their home. She could work and earn money and still have time for her young children. Their faith was also a great comfort to the family. They attended Mass each day at the Church of the Sacred Heart. Little Agnes sang in the church choir. The family became more involved in helping the poor. Drana opened her home to the poor who needed a place to stay for the night. Drana told her children to see the face of Jesus in each person they helped. Agnes remembered her mother's words. Even as a young girl, Agnes enjoyed helping people less fortunate than herself. Soon after, Agnes joined a church group called the Sodality of Mary. In the Sodality, Agnes learned about missionaries in foreign countries. Agnes enjoyed the stories of faraway lands. She prayed for the missionaries and helped raise money to send to the poor people in those distant countries. She studied maps to see where the missionaries were working. One of these far-off places was the country of India. Agnes read letters from the missionaries in India. She read about the thousands of poor people living in the bustis. the Indian word for slums. The more she read, the more Agnes believed that she should be in India helping those poor people. She believed that God was calling her to go, but how could she be sure? For several years, Agnes felt that God wanted her to be a nun. She prayed for a long time until she was sure what God wanted. Her answer came when she was 18 years old. Agnes heard about the Sisters of Loreto. The Loreto Sisters were an order of nuns who taught in Christian schools all over the world. One of these places was India. Agnes felt sure that this was God's calling for her. She knew that she would miss her family. She might never see them again, but she knew that God wanted her to be in India. She later said, "I decided to leave my home and become a nun, and since then I've never doubted that I've done the right thing. It was the will of God. It was His choice." Now Agnes had to tell her family. She wrote a letter to her brother Lazar. He had recently joined the Albanian army. When he heard of Agnes's decision, he was angry. He wrote to her that she would be wasting her life. She quickly wrote back to him. "Lazar," she wrote, "you say that you are important as an official, serving the king of 2 million people. I am an official too, serving the king of the whole world." Drana was also upset when she heard of Agnes's plans. She knew she would never see Agnes again, but she could also feel that God had called her youngest child. "Put your hand in God's hand," she told Agnes, "and walk all the way with Him." Just a few weeks later at the Skopje station, Agnes boarded a train. As it pulled away, she waved goodbye to her mother and sister and her beautiful city of Skopje. She was finally on her way, but she was not headed to India just yet. Her first stop would be in the city of Rathfarnham in the country of Ireland, where the Sisters of Loreto had their mother house. When she arrived in Ireland, everything she saw was strange and new. The weather here was much colder than in Skopje. The mother house of the Sisters of Loreto was a simple red brick building. It seemed forbidding behind a barred gate, but Agnes was comforted when she saw the statue of the Virgin Mary in the courtyard. She was now beginning her life as a nun. She wore a long white habit and the black veil of the Loreto nuns. She had come to Ireland to learn to speak English, the language the nuns used to teach India's schoolchildren. She would only be here for 6 weeks, so she worked very hard to learn the very different language. At the end of the 6 weeks, Agnes was ready to leave the mother house. In November of 1928, she boarded a ship which took her through the Suez Canal, down the Red Sea, and across the Indian Ocean to the country of India. Soon she was in the beautiful resort city of Darjeeling. Agnes was happy to finally be in India, the country she dreamed of for so many years. Now she would begin her novitiate, a period of study and prayer before taking her final vows. She studied the rules of the Loreto sisters, and she studied the Bible. She continued to study English and started to learn the Indian languages of Hindi and Bengali. In May of 1931, Agnes took her first vows as a Loreto nun. She promised to live a life of poverty, to personally own nothing, chastity, to never marry, and obedience to the superiors in the Loreto community. As in a wedding ceremony, she put on a gold ring on her right hand, a symbol that she was now married to Jesus. Now she would have to give up her old name. She would no longer be Agnes Boyajiu. She chose the name Teresa after Saint Teresa, the patron saint of missionaries. This first Teresa, known as the Little Flower, had died very young, but she believed that she could serve God by leading a life of goodness and simplicity, by doing small, humble tasks, the best that she could. Agnes became Sister Teresa in honor of Teresa, the little flower. Sister Teresa was now ready to leave Darjeeling and travel south to the city of Calcutta. At that time, Calcutta was the third largest city in India. The noisy streets were filled with ragged-looking people who earned no more than a few cents a day. These people lived in the horrible busties or slums and spent their days begging for food. Some of them were crippled and most were sick or dying. These were the poor that Sister Teresa had hoped to serve through teaching. But she had been assigned to teach the young wealthy girls at the Loreto and Tolly school. The high white walls of this convent school shut out the sights and smells of the surrounding busties. Sister Teresa would teach here for 15 years. She taught geography and history to the students from wealthy families. Early each day she would go to Mass and receive communion, and each evening would end with nighttime prayers. In May of 1937, Sister Teresa took her final vows. She pledged to serve God for the rest of her life. Soon after this, she became the principal of St. Mary's. Sister Teresa wrote to Drana back in Albania, "I am a teacher, and I love the work." But her mother replied, "Don't forget that you went to India for the sake of the poor." Every day, Sister Teresa could look out her bedroom window and see the overcrowded slums, known as the Moti Jheel. She could hear the cries and see the miserable, starving people. These were the people that she needed to help. This was why she had left her hometown of Skopje. Sister Teresa started a sodality of Mary at the convent school. It was very much like the sodality she had been in as a child. Her students were very excited to help the poor. Sister Teresa led them into the slums with medicine and food which they had collected. Sister Teresa was happy to be among the poor and the sick who could not afford help. Every September, Sister Teresa went on a retreat to Darjeeling. It was a time to get away from the students and the big city. It was a time for quiet meditation and prayer. But this year, 1946, as she rode the train to Darjeeling, Sister Teresa was not thinking of rest and relaxation. Instead, she thought of the poor people back in Calcutta, the ones she saw from her bedroom window, the ones she passed in the slums of the Moti Jheel. What could she do to help them? Just then, she felt that God was calling to her. God was telling Sister Teresa that the people in the Moti Jheel needed her. She felt that God's message was unmistakable. I was to leave the convent and help the poor while living among them, she later said. I was to give up Loreto, where I was very happy, and go out to serve Christ among the poorest of the poor. She called the experience on the train to Darjeeling a call within a call. God had called her to the Loreto order as a girl. Now God called her to serve the poor as she lived among them. But to follow God's call, she would have to be released from the vows she made as a sister of Loreto. First, she talked to a priest about her desire to leave the order. She told him that she wished to begin a new order of nuns to work with her in the slums. Father Van Exum was surprised, but agreed to share her request with the Archbishop of Calcutta. When the Archbishop heard Sister Teresa's plan, he did not feel she was ready for such a difficult challenge. The streets of Calcutta were dangerous. How would Sister Teresa survive in these living conditions? Sister Teresa would have to wait a year before making a decision. Sister Teresa waited patiently. She knew in her heart that this was God's will. And when the year was over, Sister Teresa received the good news. The Archbishop agreed to send her request to Vatican officials in Rome. The Vatican agreed to her proposal, and the Loreto sisters gave her permission to pursue her new vocation. She would be allowed to leave St. Mary's School and serve the poor while living in the slums. On August 16, 1948, Sister Teresa removed the dark nun's habit she had worn for 17 years. This stiff dress would not be right for the hot sun and the dirty streets. She put on a simple white sari, like the ones the local women wore, decorated with 3 blue stripes which reminded her of the Virgin Mary. She quietly gathered her things together and walked out of the gates of the Loreto convent. To leave Loreto, she said, was my greatest sacrifice. It was much more difficult than to leave my family, but I had to do it. It was a calling. Sister Teresa did not leave for the slums right away. First, she traveled to Patna, a town 240 miles away. There were a group of sisters in Patna who ran a Catholic hospital. Sister Teresa would spend the next several weeks learning as much about sickness and medicine as she could. These nuns saw dozens of patients every day. There was little time for detailed instruction. Sister Teresa learned by doing. She learned to give shots. She learned to clean wounds. She learned to measure medicine. She asked many questions about nutrition and hygiene. Sister Teresa told them that she wanted to live among the poor. She wanted to live just like the poor. She would dress and eat like the poor. The nuns at the hospital reminded Sister Teresa that she should always try to eat healthy food. Without the proper nutrition, she could get sick. Then what help would she be to the poor? Sister Teresa thanked the nuns for their good advice. It was now time for her to go back to Calcutta. Finally, in December of 1948, she went into the streets on her new mission. She carried no money, only a small packed lunch. When she stepped into the Moti Jheel slums, she was immediately surrounded by the sights and stench of poverty. She saw children playing on a garbage pile while rats and bugs crawled around them. She saw beggars covered in filth, scraping for a bite to eat. She saw people lying in the streets, bent and twisted with hunger and disease. So many needed help. Where would she start? Because she had been a teacher, she decided to start with the children. Under a small tree, Sister Teresa picked up a stick and started to trace letters of the alphabet in the dirt. On the first day, just a few children came to her classroom, curious to see what this woman was doing. By the end of the week, there were 40 children gathered around her. She taught them writing, needlework, and, just as important, she taught them to clean themselves. Sister Teresa's friends heard what she was doing. Soon Sister Teresa had paper for the children to write on. She had pencils and chairs for her classes. She had bars of soap to hand out as prizes. She helped them wash up before each class. She even had food and milk for the children to enjoy. The school was only the beginning. Sister Teresa spent her afternoons walking through the busties, helping to clean and bandage the sick and injured. She used the lessons she had learned at the hospital. She begged for food and medicine at the churches. But for every child she helped, there were dozens more who lived in filth. For every beggar she fed, hundreds more went hungry. This did not stop her. She did not think about the hundreds. She only thought about the one she was helping right then. All this time, Sister Teresa had been staying with the Little Sisters of the Poor, an order of nuns who also helped the starving in the slums. But Sister Teresa felt that she needed to live even closer to the people she was helping. She knew that she must. A local priest helped Sister Teresa find a room to live. It was an upstairs room in the house of a Catholic man named Mr. Gomes. Mr. Gomes was happy to let Sister Teresa stay. He did not charge her any rent, and he always made sure she had enough to eat. Sister Teresa was now close to the poor whom she was helping. She had no money to give them, only her energy and her love. Although the work was tiring and the slums were dirty, she kept working. She said that she saw the face of Jesus in each person she helped. She always remembered the words Jesus had spoken. "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me." Once she picked up a man in the street who was covered with sores. He smelled so badly that no one would come near him. Sister Teresa went to him and cleaned him. "Why are you doing this?" he said. She told him the truth. "Because I love you," she said. In March of 1949, a young girl showed up at Sister Teresa's door. Her name was Shubhashini Das. She had been a student of Sister Teresa's at St. Mary's School. Now she wanted to join Sister Teresa and help the poor. Sister Teresa told Shubhashini that the work would be hard. She would have to give up her home and her family. Shubhashini agreed. She knew that it would not be easy, but she, like Sister Teresa, felt she had a calling to work for the poorest of the poor. She became Sister Teresa's first postulant. She took the name Sister Agnes in honor of Sister Teresa's baptismal name. Other girls soon followed. They went out into the streets of Calcutta wearing the same white and blue sari as Sister Teresa. They worked in the streets of the Moti Jheel from dawn until dusk, and they took the same vows Sister Teresa had taken: poverty, chastity, and obedience, plus one more vow, a promise to serve the poorest of the poor. By the end of the year, there were 10 girls living in Mr. Gomes's house. An extra bathroom had to be built. An extra bedroom was added upstairs. The Archbishop heard the good things that Sister Teresa was doing. He was happy to give Sister Teresa permission to continue her work for the poor. He decided to let Sister Teresa set up a religious order. This would give her the independence she needed in her work. On October 7, 1950, Sister Teresa became the Mother Superior of a new order of nuns. She named the order the Missionaries of Charity. From then on, she would be known as Mother Teresa. The life of the Missionaries of Charity was demanding. They worked long hours caring for the sick, the unwanted, and the dying, many of whom had open sores on their bodies. They met each morning at 4:45 to pray and celebrate Mass before breakfast. Then they walked together onto the streets of the Moti Jheel. In just a short time, there were 27 girls living upstairs in the Gomes house. Mother Teresa knew that she needed a larger home for her order. She walked the streets looking for a new place. The local priest rode his bicycle through the city in search for a new mother house. Soon they heard that a wealthy man was leaving Calcutta. He owned a 3-story house near the Busties. He was anxious to move to a more peaceful place. When the priest told him about Mother Teresa, he said he would gladly give her his house. The Archbishop lent Mother Teresa the money to buy the land, and in February of 1953, she and the sisters moved into their new home. It would be the new headquarters for the Missionaries of Charity. Mother Teresa helped the sisters with the chores every day, and every day she continued to go out into the slums with the sisters. Mother Teresa reminded them to see the face of Jesus in every person they helped. She wanted them to touch Christ in the distressing disguise of the poor. One day, Mother Teresa found a dying woman lying in the gutter. She was covered with sores and bugs. Rats had bitten her hands and legs. Why would no one help her? The Hindu people believe that when a person suffers, she is being paid back for something wrong she did in a previous life. This is called karma. There is nothing you can do to help someone with bad karma. Mother Teresa did not believe in karma. She believed in love, the love of Jesus. Mother Teresa wanted to help this dying woman. She carried her from the street to the hospital, but the people in the hospital did not want to help the woman either. Mother Teresa told the hospital staff that she would stay right there until they took the poor woman in. She said they had to take her. At last, they admitted the old woman to the hospital and took care of her. That very day, Mother Teresa went to City Hall. She told them she needed a place where she could take care of the dying, a place where the dying could be cleaned and cared for and loved like human beings, not left in the gutters. A beautiful death, she said, is for people who lived like animals, to die like angels, loved and wanted. The city officials had good news. There was a place that Mother Teresa could use. It was an abandoned building behind the large Hindu temple. It had been used for travelers who visited the temple. Now Mother Teresa could use it to open a place for the poor to die with dignity. Mother Teresa and the sisters quickly cleaned the building up. Within a week, it was ready. The sisters began to bring the sick and dying off the street and lay them on the clean floor. They washed them and fed them and held their hands. They smiled and hugged them. They named their new building Nirmal Hriday, the place of the Immaculate Heart. The people who lived near the home for the dying began to complain. Why was Mother Teresa helping these dying people? She could not change their karma. Was she trying to make them Catholic? When they came to see what Mother Teresa was doing, they saw how tenderly she cared for the dying. They saw that she truly loved each of the sick people. She only wanted them to die in a happy place, surrounded by love. Instead of complaining, the neighbors asked if they could help take care of the sick and dying too. Now Mother Teresa had a home for the dying. But what about the children? There was still the school in the Motigil, but those children were all still homeless and poor. And what about the orphans, the children of people who had died in the Nirmal Hriday? Mother Teresa opened another new home named the Shishu Bhavan. It was for the children. Mother Teresa and the sisters filled the Shishu Bhavan with orphaned children. They brought in the babies that were abandoned on the street. The children were cleaned and fed and loved. Tiny babies were being saved. And they were being adopted. Families from India and other places in the world came to Mother Teresa to share their love with these healthy boys and girls. Money was donated to give the babies the food and clothing they needed. Mother Teresa urged mothers considering abortion to have their babies. She offered the services of the missionaries of charity to care for any unwanted children. She used the money that people sent to help these growing children prepare for life after the Shishu Bhavan. She helped them to find a way out of the slums. There was another group of people who needed help. These people had a sickness called Hansen's disease, or leprosy. Many people were afraid of catching the disease. They were afraid of the terrible sores on the skin and the loss of fingers and toes. Mother Teresa was not afraid. She wanted to help these people too. Mother Teresa set up clinics throughout the city, but people with the disease were embarrassed to come for treatment. Mother Teresa thought of another way to help. She would take the treatment to them. She was given a van, which she filled with medicine and food. She rode around Calcutta with a doctor, helping the people with this frightening illness. A few years later, Mother Teresa opened the Shanti Nagar, the town of peace. It was a small group of houses outside of Calcutta. People with leprosy could move into this community to live and work in a place of their own. They would not have to hide their disease. They would not have to live on the street. As the years passed, more young women came to join Mother Teresa in her work for the poor. Soon, even the 3-story house was filled to overflowing. Mother Teresa knew that the work was very hard. Cleaning the wounds of the sick and holding the hands of the dying could be sad. Each new girl had to serve the poor for 6 months before they were allowed to join the missionaries of charity. Volunteers came by the hundreds. A woman named Anne Blakey wanted to help. She formed a group called the Co-Workers. She and her friends gathered food and clothing to give to Mother Teresa's poor. Soon there were groups of co-workers sending food from all over the globe. Mother Teresa knew that Calcutta was not the only place in the world where poor people lived. In 1959, she picked a handful of sisters and traveled over 200 miles to the Indian district of Bihar. There she set up the first Missionaries of Charity house outside of Calcutta. In 1965, the Pope gave Mother Teresa some very good news. She had permission from Rome to open houses all over the world, not just in India. Mother Teresa wasted no time. A group of sisters flew from Calcutta to the country of Venezuela in South America. They moved into an abandoned hotel and began to serve the poor people in that country. Soon, more and more houses opened. One in Australia, one in Africa. The Pope himself asked that Mother Teresa open a mission house to serve the poor people in Rome. And in 1971, a home was opened in New York City, the first Missionaries of Charity in the United States. Mother Teresa flew from country to country, visiting these new houses. Mother Teresa was becoming famous. Colleges and universities all over the world invited her to speak to the students about her work with the poor. In 1971, she was awarded the Pope John XXIII Peace Prize. She was given India's Nehru Award for her work helping the war victims in the poor country of Bangladesh. The prize money from these awards was always given to the poor. Mother Teresa did not want it for herself. In December of 1979, Mother Teresa stepped out of a plane in Oslo, Norway. Over 30 years had passed since she had stepped out into the slums of Calcutta. Then she was greeted by the smells of the poor. Today, she was greeted by the cheers of thousands of people. This 69-year-old nun was being honored with the world's greatest award, the Nobel Peace Prize. Mother Teresa smiled as she spoke to the crowd. She told them of her desire to help the poor, a desire she had as a little girl in Skopje, a desire that led her to the Sisters of Loreto, and at last to the streets of India, a desire that had spread all over the globe. Wherever there are persons who are not loved, not wanted, not cared for, she said, this is the greatest poverty. Mother Teresa's work was now known all over the world. These awards and honors did not mean that Mother Teresa's work was done. In 1987, the Missionaries of Charity opened special care homes in New York and California for the victims of AIDS. And by 1997, there were 550 Missionaries of Charity houses in 126 different countries. Though her health was beginning to fail, there seemed no end in sight to her work with the poor. She spent months at a time traveling around the world, opening new homes, begging for food for the poor, greeting the people she met with a smile, seeing Jesus in each and every new face, never pausing in her work for the poor despite her advanced age. When people told her to slow down, to take time for herself, she would just smile. Life is not worth living unless it is lived for others, she told a friend. There is so much still to do, and I have an eternity to rest. Now Mother Teresa is at rest. Jesus holds her safe in heaven, just as she held so many safe in her own arms. Mother Teresa's work is still not done. There are still millions of people without food, without shelter, living dirty in the street. Mother Teresa saw Jesus' face in the face of each of these people. Maybe you can see Jesus' face there too.